Good morning and welcome to the Davos Lab Dialogues. And the topic for today is an agenda on education. So basically, we are going to be unpacking if Botswana is getting return on investment on education. This is based on the premise that over the years, Botswana has spent so much money investing on education. But we want to find out today is, are we getting return on investment based on basically the escalating statistics of unemployment, based on also poverty in the nation? And today, I am going to be your host, and my name is Juby Peacock, and I am currently working as a PEPFAR at the PEPFAR country office in administration. I am Achieving Scholar 2018, a Mandela Fellow 2016, alumna of the University of Sussex and the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, which is #1 in the world. I've also worked for the Ministry of Health in Botswana for 10 years. I have, with some friends of mine, opened a very successful NGO in Maun called Poeta Bango Spoken Word Poetry, which has done phenomenal things in the education and the development space in Botswana. I'm also a poet, a blogger, a magazine columnist, and a motivational speaker extraordinaire. Today, I will be having 3 young people in the panel who will be helping us unpack this topic. And I'm going to start with panelist Tshimologo Matlhaga. Tshimologo is an aspiring international development practitioner with a keen interest in work that is focused on addressing Africa's development challenges through an emphasis on education policy and the strengthening of governance institutions. She has experience in the higher education sector as the University of Botswana lecturer. Tshimologo currently works in an NGO focused on adapting and scaling up health and education programs for young people in Botswana and in Southern Africa. And now I'll introduce Mr. Kaene Disepo. Kaene's passion lies in diplomacy and international development, having been a country delegate of over 30 global forums. In education, unemployment, good governance, and social inclusion. He's a leadership and development consultant with a work portfolio that includes UNDP, UNESCO, Inter-America Development Bank, Commonwealth, GIDS, and Victoria League for Commonwealth Friendships, and recently, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it well, but it's AFTA Youth Forum. And he is the founder of both Inspired Horizons Association and Change Africa, the former and education NGO that has impacted over 15,000 communities through grassroots initiatives that focus on improving access to quality education, to ease challenges of structural unemployment, amongst many. Inspired Horizons pioneered in the country's international universities career fair and launched the first young mother support program in the country. He has a very packed bio. So also leadership development consultancy that has championed initiatives such as Debating Botswana, the country's toughest, most engaging, most inclusive, and most impactful debating forum. Debating Botswana is the country's first safe platform that young people can use to debate on key development issues, having relevant industry experts and policy influencers as adjudicators and mentors. Kaene sits on numerous boards, including the Human Resource Professional Society of Botswana, youngest member of the Botswana's Top Achievers Review Committee, and Botswana's National Youth Council Board, of which he is the official National Youth Delegate on all Commonwealth affairs from 2021 to 2023. Mr. Disepo has both a BSc in International Relations and an MSc in Development Management from London School of Economics. Amongst his many accolades, Kaene is the recipient of the 2018 Youth Africa Leadership Award, BNYC's Best Youth in Academic Excellence, Rare Rising Star, second best Black student in the university in the United Kingdom, and was recognized as Britain's top 100 young future leaders of African and Caribbean descent. Lastly, I'll introduce our panel list Lillian Moremi. Lillian Moremi has over 10 years of experience in driving youth development. Excuse me. Lillian Moremi has over 10 years of experience in driving the youth development agenda in Botswana, specifically focusing on youth leadership and promoting youth employment services in Africa, preparing young people for the labor market and to access sustainable jobs. She's a founder of Botswana Student Network and currently learning and development consultant at Career Coaching, a social enterprise she formed in 2013 to promote skills development and productivity in the workplace. Her work involves to help organizations successfully transition graduates from school to the world of work. Lillian is Girls for Girls, Botswana's country team leader, a mentorship network empowering women to lead. She's a moderator for Youth Match GIZ, through GIZ, a global network of experts in employment services, and the Yali Alumni Youth for Africa Leadership Initiatives, Mandela Washington Fellowship alumna. Lillian is available for consultancy work on education, promotion, entrepreneurship development, and employment creation. As part of her continuous community outreach, Lillian enjoys giving career and professional development advice to students, job seekers, professionals during her spare time. And for more work, you can catch her at her website. Are we together? So we are going to now start with really unpacking this topic, and I'm going to call upon my panelists who I just introduced you to just help us navigate this very, very important topic for Botswana today. And can I start this conversation off by just asking Mr. Kaene, I need to pronounce that name properly. So it's Kaene Disepo. Kaene, can you kick us off with just expressing, in your own opinion, what is it that we are not doing right as a nation? Why are we consistently experiencing a skills mismatch?
Thank you so much, Juby, and also thank you so much for having me in this great panel. I must say I'm looking at my colleagues, and I'm extremely happy because there's some that have actually pioneered the way for my passion, particularly in inclusive education policies. So quite briefly, what I'll just say is, you know, the reason why I started Inspired Horizons Association particularly is to champion ways on how we can ease access to quality education. So I think your question it rightfully fits, because it's pretty much asking why the need to do Inspired Horizons. I would say this, when we were growing up, one of the biggest oversights that I've noticed is that, particularly when you are under the Ministry of Basic Education, that deals with, you know, junior schools, senior schools, primary schools, we see that the subjects that we're learning consistently, in as much as they're great, but however, they're not directly relatable when we are speaking about 21st century context, right? So right now, we are seeing so many young people around the world who are 13 years old and they're becoming millionaires. We are seeing so many incredible, you know, young learners leaving schools to go and start their apps, and now they're becoming, you know, one of the biggest billionaires in the countries or in the world, right? And the issue is, what then are we doing that's wrong, or potentially an oversight in our country? And I would say one of the things I've noticed is that we don't necessarily have components that are quite specific, or components that will actually develop the skill sets that are required for 21st century world. We don't have within our key curriculum issues of innovation. We don't have issues of entrepreneurial development, where subjects like agriculture, for instance, there's often that missing link on how a young learner could apply the theory into the practice, right? And yet, or most of us, we have access to land. However, we don't actually know when we're learning about poultry, we can actually now start looking at it from a commercial side at home. I think some of the biggest issues that are also missing is not just the business side of things, but also the interpersonal skill sets, right? How are we going to be speaking about 21st century context without even having an understanding of what communication skills are? Right? How do we have an ability to articulate oneself? How do we have an ability to influence policies if we are not capacitated, particularly at a tender age, in order for us to have those? So at Inspired Horizons, our mandate is to ensure that we co-create policies and interventions that will not only create successful young leaders, but leaders of value, and those are proactive, well-informed, and well-passionate. So I think this is potentially one of the biggest things that we're experiencing, particularly with the skill set, is that the lack of synergies on thriving bodies that will actually lead to a coherent and something which is quite relevant to what the industry requires now.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed, I like listening to your accent and you articulating those issues in a very high profile. I'm going to jump right into Tshimologo Matlhaga. I know you might think I made a mistake by not asking you first to generally articulate what you think about the topic. I will get back to that. But in the meantime, I just really want us to jump into this first question. Why are we experiencing a mismatch? And Tshimologo Matlhaga, with your background working with our highest Institute of Education, the University of Botswana, and in your journey now that sees you working for an NGO that reaches the grassroots, why do you think, why are we as a nation always experiencing a mismatch from your own experience?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Good morning, fellow panelists. Thank you so much, Juby, just for the question. Yeah, thank you just for posing it in terms of even my experience, because I think that just looking back at, just my experience in the education sector has really kind of opened my eyes just to the situation that we have in Botswana. And I have a lot of, thoughts around why we find ourselves in the situation that we're in. And I think even just to borrow from a lot of what Kaene is saying, a lot of what I noticed when I was an educator, and I intentionally say educator as opposed to a lecturer, because a lot of what you see is that, in, let's say, a higher education institution, people are being lectured at. And I'm like, first of all, that right there is like a number one problem, because we are then creating students who are just passive recipients of knowledge. And so a lot of what I was finding, a lot of what I've seen is that a lot of the focus is really on just classroom learning. And as we are looking at, the 21st century as a kind of, jobs that are opening up, we have things like AI, they require just a whole different way of thinking. But if we're continually educating people in a way that is very, I'm just here, I'm lecturing, you're the recipient of information, there you go. At the end of the term, you write an exam that is just based on you, how well you're able to grasp the knowledge and how you're able to repeat it back to me, then it isn't really a huge surprise that you then take those very same students, put them in the workplace, you ask them to think for themselves, you ask them to make presentations, you ask them just to, to critically analyze, to write documents, etc. And you find that it actually isn't possible because the way that we have actually taught them to engage with knowledge has not allowed them to actually be, to interact with it. And I think it's so interesting that we still teach that way, because a lot of research has actually shown that 70% of how a person learns is from doing, and you actually only learn or retain 10% of the kind of information and knowledge that you just hear somebody else saying to you. And so in essence, if we're still doing this whole lecturing, in essence we're actually only unlocking 10% of our students' potential. We aren't actually exposing them to other ways that they can actually gain skills, allowing them to engage really with material, with ideas, allowing them even to challenge ways of thinking. I remember a lot of the time when I was teaching, one of the first things I'd say to my students is, you're allowed to actually challenge what I say to you in the classroom. And they would be so surprised, like, what are you saying? And I'd say, yes, this is meant to be interactive. It is meant to be engaging. I am not the holder of knowledge in this classroom. You come with experiences, your classmates come with experiences, and we can be here and learn from each other. And I'd spend a whole semester trying to get them to actually understand that this is an interactive, engaging process. It's not meant to be coming for, 45 minutes, telling them a whole bunch of things, and then, that's all that they're there for. And I found it was so difficult because it was almost like I was meeting a lot of students at the end of so a lot of the students that I taught were around third year, some fourth years, so essentially they were at the end of, their journey in the, in the education space and, in the university context. And I felt like I was trying to like reorder, something that they had learned over a whole, journey of being in the system. And I think it just, even just that right there made me go, this is a huge problem, because if the way that we're teaching isn't actually engaging and allowing people to develop skills and interest, even just the desire and the passion to learn, if that's not even there, then, you don't actually learn how to become a lifelong learner. Because I think a lot of the jobs that we're seeing and just how the world functions now requires you to be a lifelong learner. You can't leave university and say have a degree and like that's it. You're constantly learning on the job. Technology is changing. The way the world, functions is changing. We've seen with COVID-19, we've had to adapt. And so if you aren't, really cultivating students that are able to keep learning and that have the interest to keep learning, then it almost really explains why at the end of the day, we're really having such an issue with when they then come into the workplace and just the skills mismatch that we're seeing. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what I would say just to begin with.
So when I hear you right, you're basically saying by the time the students get to the highest institute of learning, they have already been programmed to think and contribute a certain way. And here you were as a lecturer, you were trying to help them to think outside the box, to innovate, to be creative. And what I'm hearing you saying is that you discovered that from the space that they were coming at, they already been programmed a certain way in the way they think and in their education. Am I right?
Yeah, and I think not just from where they were coming from, even within our high institutions as well, that is very much part and parcel. So as I was saying, even the term lecturer, I didn't like it because I thought, well, I'm not there to lecture at you. That's not what I'm there for. So a lot of my people would often say, why do you call yourself an educator? You're a lecturer. And I'm like, I get what that means, but I'm like, it actually speaks to a deeper understanding of what I feel education should be. And so I'm not there to lecture you. And I think even just that, something as small as how we identify the people that go in to teach our children, it already just shows you the kind of mindset that we're operating with.
Okay, I'm going to just allow our third panelist, Lillian Moremi, to also, being somebody who has really pioneered and tried to close the gap, the space between our education and the careers that are available in the 21st century by even coaching. And, over the years, I've seen this young lady even try to advocate for policy reform in education and just trying to smooth the spaces, the lines between the kind of education that the students are receiving and the kind of employers that the employers are looking for. So Lillian, from your experience, being in the field, doing so much community work, and also just, providing all of these platforms for young people where you help them and prepare them for the workspace, what is missing? The question is, what are we not doing right? Why are we consistently experiencing a skills mismatch?
Thank you, Juby, and of course, thank you to the Global Shapers organization for having organized a very important discussion. I hope I'm audible enough. Is that okay?
Yes.
Because
yes.
I currently have challenges, so just let me know. Give me any feedback on that. Look, a journey of 1,000 miles. We talk about mismatch. What is mismatch? Do young people understand what mismatch is? I've always been fascinated, when I graduated, I said, I graduated with a degree, an undergrad in accounting, and I realized, no, man, that's not who I am. I want to do something that I really like. And I went into that space. And this is why we created Botswana Student Network, with a network of incredibly amazing young people across Botswana, because we were all concerned. You know, every time when we finish from tertiary, and you know, the story was always that you go to school, then you go to work. But of course, you know, during our time, things were changing. That wasn't always the narrative now. The narrative was changing. The narrative was to say, look, young people are unemployed. What's happening with our education system? And funny enough, as people on the ground, or as Botswana in general, you must observe this. Every time our results come out, standard 7, Form 3 results, Form 5 results, then everybody gets to point a finger. Everybody gets to point a finger to say, your results are so bad, you know, so-and-so is not doing right. But, you know, as you are pointing a finger, 3 more small fingers are pointing back at you to say, but what are you doing? So I've always been very fascinated by that concept of pointing a finger at someone, but more fingers are pointing back at me. And this was the whole idea of starting Botswana Student Network, because we really wanted the learner to champion the learning, because that is how us as young people, as learners, we are going to, you know, be able to contribute to that return on investment of education. Because we are taken to education so that not only are we going to better our lives, but we are going to better the lives of our communities. We are going to better the life of Botswana in general. I mean, when you look at our unemployment rate sitting at about 23% or so, it's quite, you know, it's quite concerning, you know, because when you look at other countries around the globe, I mean, look at Rwanda. I looked at Rwanda's unemployment rate was about 1%. What is Rwanda doing right that we are not doing right? How can we learn from Rwanda? Anyway, so really with the work that I've been doing over the years, it's always been to say, as an individual, particularly as the young person, because we have this huge challenge of graduating and struggling to find, you know, meaningful employment. What are we actually doing to ensure that we don't, you know, we don't form part of the statistic, because it's also our responsibility to ensure that we champion that. And so a lot of the work that I've done within the public sector, within the private sector, and international institutions is to champion that. You know, because we also, I realized, you know, but working together as a collective, we can achieve so much. Look at how we were able to build our first university, the University of Botswana. Everybody contributed. Our parents contributed towards that. And so going back to your question about where are we not getting it right, my angle comes from young people understanding that we need to prepare ourselves at all times. We now know that our education system is challenged, but as you reflect as a student, what is your role? Education, like Tshimologo was saying, you know, we have to aspire to be lifelong learners. And it's not necessarily about education being in the classroom. Education is everywhere. You know, education is the people that you meet, the events. This is part of our education system. And I really want to encourage a learner, young people, to learn as much as they can, because this is through learning you are able to identify the challenges, but not only glorify the challenges, but you are able to introspect and you say, but how do I also take that in coming up with solutions for these challenges, whether the challenges are affecting me directly or those around us. So in terms of the mismatch that we are find happening, young people need to really stand up and see how they can work, you know, with the private sector, even with government and other international institutions, to see how they can better their lives or take advantage of the opportunities that are being presented to us, because the opportunities are there. I studied accounting, but I realized later on, I should, I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship because it's one of the vehicles that is really going to address unemployment in the country. And I took the initiative over the past 10 years to really learn about, because we are the first generation of entrepreneurs, particularly my interest within the social enterprise space. I took a lot of time really investing myself, learning online, doing free online courses, taking advantage of programs that are offered by different NGOs on the ground. So lifelong learning, that is it, And so I think my line of interest to really encourage young people from that area. And most importantly, issues of career guidance. I know a huge element of our career guidance, we only leave it with the school setup, but we must all understand that career guidance, it cuts across. Everybody needs career guidance, whether you are a student at primary education, whether you are a student at secondary, at tertiary, even when you graduate, you still need career guidance, even when you are in the workplace. So it never really stops. And so with the challenges that are faced within the education system, we need the private sector, we need the NGO, we need the international institutions to also come to the table and help form structures or form resource centers that young people can have access to outside the schooling system. During school holidays, where do we go to access career guidance? Things like that as a nation, we also need to introspect about. And when we talk about the mismatch, I really want us to also look at the fact that quite a lot is being done within the metropolitan areas. And you'd find that the most challenge lies within the villages or the rural areas. And so this is where we also need to champion a lot of the solutions that are looking into improving our education system. Yeah, and just to end off my point here, there's an organization called Young Love. They are promoting teaching at the right level approach. Because right now, when our education system really promotes teaching at age at 12 years old, you're supposed to be in the standard. But that's questionable, because we have problems within our education system where a standard 7 is not able to read and write. And these are worrisome issues. So we need an education system that can teach at the right level. We need young people to be grouped according to their learning abilities, their learning levels as well. And so it's really humbling to see such organizations coming to the forefront to partner up with institutions such as UNICEF or USAID and government to say, no, but we need to champion this. We need to correct our education system so that it can favor students with learning disabilities. It can favor, students that didn't make a breakthrough at the foundation level. So there is so much I'm sure that we will explore in this call. And once again, thank you so much for this opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you so much. And also just unpacking that question in the levels at which we have mismatches. You mentioned the children who are living with disabilities, and then in disabilities, you unpacked even different levels of learning, and that, amplifying the thing that Tshimologo was saying earlier on, that, there has to be lifelong learning, and you just taking it back to saying to the learner, it is also your responsibility. Moving this topic forward, and we are still really defining this topic because we are going to really thresh it. But I believe just moving it forward, I'm going to take us back to the actual topic: is Botswana getting return on investment on education? And I want the panelists to really look at this topic. And I think Kaene talked about it a little bit earlier on, but you didn't elaborate, but you're basically talking about the international world of work and how things work in the workspace, and if our learners are prepared for that. And I really want you to really give us your sentiments about what do you think? Are we getting a return on investment? And also just when you are threshing it out, just look at countries like Rwanda, like Lillian was saying, also Finland being a country which is, renowned for having the best education systems in the world, making that comparison. What do you think? Are we getting a return on investment in our education, as reflected even in our economy? Also, have you mentioned that we have high unemployment rate and poverty? Kaene, you can take over.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's it's a really packed. Yes, you can hear me, right? Fantastic.
Yes.
I was gonna say it's a really packed question, because I think, particularly for Botswana, I mean, one of the biggest issues that we need to be asking ourselves is that at policy design, fundamentally, what is the reason for the investment in education, right? I think for a particular country like Botswana, where it's a welfare state with the free provision of, education and the sponsorships when we get into tertiary education, it's a lot of investment. And we're also building on it by actually, having much more of our international students going to study abroad. So there's a clear reason that Botswana would love to invest into education, right? And I think what will be important is to understand from their angle, what is that reason? But particularly, I think for us as grassroots innovators, and particularly in education, there are essential reasons as to why one would invest in education, right? So one is to make sure that we have a full understanding of what learning essentially is. So the essence of learning in itself. And, it's important to highlight that the essence of learning is not so much about making sure that you get the best grades. And I think I've spent quite a lot of time in making sure that we're changing this culture of what academic excellence is, to say that it's not only rooted in grades, right? And if that's the case, therefore, education itself is the ability to learn and relearn. So if that's the ability to learn and relearn, it means that that should be a window to explore different opportunities. That should be a window to have a mindset that will be able to understand the cause of things, not necessarily why this is so, but really to understand why that came about. And I think it's important to really explore it from that angle. The second is to make sure that when you're investing in education, you have a pool of incredibly talented young individuals that will also have those talents developed, right? So you are developing to ensure that you're able to build the economy, you are able to build the nation, you're able to build even an individual to have the necessary capacity to lead, to leave a legacy of long-lasting human capital development. And also, more so, I think when you're touching on the reason why it would be important to invest in education is, of course, to overcome the structural challenges that we're currently experiencing. It's very concerning for a country that has less than 3 million people as a collective, but with so much money and resources, that we're still currently at a stage where we're not competing with the likes of Juby. Right? So I think in understanding those structural challenges, why is it that we're having a proliferation of tertiary institutions? Why is it that we're having many and many tertiary institutions every year, and graduates who are currently not being employed, graduates who are not even employers themselves, right? And yet there's millions of money that is being spent to it. Why is it that we're still at a point where we're suffering so much when we're talking about efficiencies, efficient structures, right? The standard operating procedures, why is it so slow? And why is it that every time we network, yet we're investing so much? I often say there's a propensity in Botswana for people to walk slow. And I was like, kind of when you're walking slow, even you're thinking it's slow, right? And often the education system, the way it's structured, it's very slow in its approach. We take so long in order for us to really impart the necessary skills. So I would say that one of the biggest oversights, and particularly in investing in education, is that we're not investing in people to relearn. We're investing in people who can properly take grades. So we're investing in people who are essentially regurgitators, right? They take in information the way it is and then just cop it out exactly the way it is, which is why our rites of passage is always so linear. We're taught that go to school to get the best grades, and then you can find a job. So nobody's really teaching you about things beyond that. And that's why we always conform to it. What's particularly different then is how countries like Finland actually invest in education and why they're so-called, the best in their education system. So Finland, particularly, what they strive as is two fundamental things. One, they focus on equality, right? So equality in itself is not necessarily the equality that we know of, equality of opportunities, right? Equality in itself is to make sure that each and every single learner is at a point where whatever information that they're being fed is able to apply. So each learner is able to actually apply it in a way that the other learner would see the world in the same fashion, right? So is the equality in the sense of, one, we're not even focusing on mandated standardized tests. So we actually don't know for us where we're building a system of competition. That's not even the case in Finland, right? Because the important aim there is to make sure that you're learning how to learn. So you're not learning how to get the grades, but you're learning how to learn. So equality, therefore, it becomes an essential aspect. And that's why you overcome issues of skills mismatch. Because it's so easy to see the society the way it is, right? That's how it's so easy, therefore, to make sure that another individual, right? Because they're not built to be competitive. They're built actually on a consensus creations, right? So nation building in itself, it becomes very foundational. The other thing, which I guess this one would be kind of like the obvious one, is that the teacher-student ratio, right? So in Finland, we don't really see a lot of one teacher teaching 42 plus students. And when you think about it from a practical angle, how are you able to educate? Tshimologo was talking about educators, which is something that even in Finland they really stress on. How are you able to educate on an individual level? How are you as a teacher capacitated to teach a class of 42 students and make sure that once they graduate, they all are able to thrive, they all have realized their fullest potential? That becomes incredibly difficult. So what Finland do is that they look at an individual by actually looking at what's called a learner profiling. So they focus on making sure that there is an in-depth study of an individual learner. And you can only do this if you have smaller classrooms, right? So that we understand that, that particular student is able to learn best through visual presentations. Some others are better in audio, right? Some others, they don't even really look at the theoretical aspect, but they do great when you're looking at the practical stuff, the design and technology, arts, vocational skills, right? And therefore, the focus is on really capacitating, nurturing, and developing that, which is why you would see that, teachers in Finland, they don't really spend a lot of time in classrooms as opposed to here. The focus is really more on building those extracurricular activities, nurturing the talents of the individual students, really focusing on rehabilitation rather than punitive measures. So you don't see a lot of, corporal punishment one night there. You see a lot of trying to understand why is this individual having a slow day, what is difficult maybe for that being. So we're really focusing on the overall well-being of an individual rather than looking at a student as a purely statistics to make sure that they get the grades. So there's a lot of things. And this is why, overall, the focus therefore is on the equality of the wellness of the individual, right? Not necessarily on the equality of the marks or the average grades. And which is why I think in this particular instance, it's so great that Lillian would even raise teaching at the right level, something that's young love. Because what's important about it, and this is something that we're also working on, but on an e-learning platform with Inspired Horizons, is that we want to focus on making sure that first and foremost, teachers are fully capacitated, the educators are fully capacitated to understand the diverse backgrounds of the individuals that they're going to be educating. And there is no way that you can actually execute that to the best level if you don't understand who you are teaching, right? So we need to spend more time in training educators to see how best they can also become educators. It's really unfortunate because in Finland, actually, the teachers, educators, you go to school to teach. It's not something that is a push factor, right? It's actually quite like elitist thing, just like being a lawyer, right? You go in a master's to teach. So it's actually not just like, well, I don't have anything, so I'm going to become a temporary teacher. And therefore, because your passion is not there, you were not training to educate, you're actually training for something else. But in Finland, they are training to educate. And I think those are some of the biggest oversights that we don't see in Botswana.
Yeah, I really like the points that you've pulled out, even the fact that the way we classify careers in Botswana and how, law is an elitist thing and then teaching is like a secondary thing. But, because I also want you to go further from just talking about education to talk about, return on investment and into our economy now. Because if we are really producing the right learners, we should be growing our economy. We're talking about countries like Finland who don't rely on natural resources, but they have built an economy. It's one of the coldest countries in the world, but they've managed to build an economy. And it means there's something that we are not doing right as a nation. And I want you to just thresh it out. How would it look like if we were to say that we are getting return on investment from our education? How should it look like? And I'm so glad that you brought all those levels of what needs to be corrected in the education system. But just give us a glimpse of what our economy should be looking like, the nations who we are supposed to be competing with according to the foundations that we've had as a nation.
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, when you look at it purely from a comparison side, right? You have countries that, in as much as, let's say, the United Arab Emirates, they're boosted by oils, right? But you have countries that 50 years back, there was just pure sand. This is it was a desert. This is a country that has actually now kind of like the biggest, man-made marine, and yet it's a desert. Botswana, 85% of it is a desert. Botswana also really relies on diamonds, right? There is nothing, and I can really say there's nothing really that's stopping Botswana from getting to a point where it's even competing with the likes of Singapore, where it's competing with the likes of Dubai, right? Why is that? One, we have the natural resources, right? And for us, because we didn't have what's called the resource curse, where because of our diamonds, now we're seeing like internal conflicts of which other countries in Africa have really struggled for, right? Where there's so much killing and internal conflicts and so on. We didn't have that, right? And I think sometimes, this might be controversial, but again, it's true. Sometimes when we're speaking about a country like Botswana, we speak of it in such an arbitrary concept, as if we're forgetting that Botswana is fundamentally run by people. You have people that are running the engines, that are running that vehicle. And I'm not, I think ashamed or afraid to say that there are so many instances where we have even approached some of the relevant stakeholders and we're met with so much resistance, right? Talking about the investment in infrastructural development, particularly when you're talking about issues of e-governance, virtual learning. This is not new. And what's interesting about it is that it's not a new concept in Botswana. Prior, about 2009, 2010, when we started having the e-passports, right? There was a lot of e-governance, particularly with new public administration. But then that fizzled. So now you're actually seeing that with COVID-19, because of a push factor, a pandemic, we have accelerated the rate at which we're embracing technology. And you ask yourself, where was the resources to facilitate this before it was there? Where was the mindset to say, well, we actually need to be embracing much more of the fourth industrial revolution before it was there? Because you have a lot of us who have studied abroad. Botswana is not working in silos, right? Where was the continuous agreements? We actually have a lot of bilateral relations, trade relations that we could be tapping into. We have the likes of AGOA, which facilitates trade relations with America at really incredible benefits, right? But how are we benefiting from that? We're not actually utilizing them, right? So I think these are some of the things that there's nothing stopping Botswana from getting to a place where we could accelerate at a faster pace than most of our counterparts. Unfortunately, fundamentally is that a country is run by people, people sometimes with an inertia or resistance to embrace change, to embrace innovation. Botswana heavily relies on value. Sometimes I'm a key critic of culture in itself because you know, the values that we speak of, boto, humility. Sometimes when a young person like Kaene comes to and, you know, brings an idea forth, we're met with, hey, or hey, so it seems like we are, whilst we're pointing at one of the things that we could be learning, right, from our international exposure, it seems like we're directly critiquing someone. And there's a sense of belonging and attachment to that person's position because they've been in it for more than 30 years. So how dare Kaene come in to try to change the system? So I think these are some of the things that, in as much as we're saying we're investing in education, we're actually not realizing that the investment that are now being invested in education is creating the likes of Kaene Disepo, who have, you know, vast experience in international exposure, who are willing and coming to Botswana to say, this is what the rest of the world is doing. This is how we can push and go beyond our limits. But we're met with so much resistance.
Yeah, I would just like to, at this juncture, just encourage our viewers that you are free to send us questions on the chat box on the right. Just send us questions. I mean, Kaene is saying so many things, and if I'm not careful, I'll stay here all day long asking him question over question. But I'm going to have to move over and move on to just converse a little bit more with Lillian Moremi. And I think this question specifically very, very important for her to address because, you know, she talks about different levels of education when she was introducing herself in her speech. And I want to know, Lillian, should we introduce multiple pathways from primary to education now? Multiple pathways to education from primary education now?
The introduction of multiple pathways, it's actually currently underway. You know, the last time I made that, I found out that Moeding College, they were actually making a rollout of that. And I know that the government is actually putting up plans to expand that rollout. And I think it'll be a good pilot project just to see, because we've been talking about it for a very long time. And it's indeed heartwarming that finally it's happening. And of course, we are testing it out. We will see. Now, when you talk about pathways at a primary level, absolutely, I think it is worth a look into. However, you know, we spoke about Finland earlier on, and Kaene mentioned a lot of amazing things about Finland.
Yeah.
One of the things that in Finland very successful in their education system is the fact that they really invest in the foundation of the learner, you know, the pre-primary education, the lower education. And I know for sure, one of the biggest challenges that we are facing within our education system in Botswana is that the foundation level really needs a lot of investment. And this is why we've seen a lot of investment within the pre-primary education to say, we need now our learners to start from zero to do a lot of breakthrough activities. Now, a lot of people might be wondering, what is breakthrough? You know, our learners being taught to understand issues of literacy and numeracy. And like I did say, that's why also you have institutions such as Young Love who are going into that space. You know, as Botswana, we need to invest a lot at that level, because it's very worrisome, really, really worrisome. A standard 3 who is not able to say the very basics to articulate themselves. And what we find happening is that also, as before, our education system, it keeps on moving you on to the next stage, but you haven't really, you know, performed so well. And what we see, for instance, you know, when COVID struck, there were so many challenges. We had to relearn how we are going to adapt the education system. And now, mind you, we had like standard 7, form 3, and form 5s who had to write exams. And now you imagine how every time our system is churning our graduates or our learners to go to the next level without having really gone through the proper way of learning for that particular year because of the challenges that we are facing. So at that point in time, when you talk about a pathways, introduction of pathways. It's a noble idea. However, I think really as a country, we need to invest a lot, particularly within our pre-primary education and lower primary education, because really this is where we need to get it right when it comes to literacy development, when it comes to numeracy development as well. There was a project that I was also part of a couple of years ago. It was an Australian foundation. We were working in partnership with the Ministry of Education to try and address this issue, particularly in the rural area, because really that's always been my interest, to say, how are we championing a lot of these solutions in the rural areas, because this is where really limited resources are. And like Kaene say, we talk about return on investment, but the biggest challenge to our return on investment in education is the mindset, the culture that we have, the systems, the processes that we have, the mindset, within our education system. And we need to change that. The funny thing is, we know what needs to be done. We've done research. We even have written up documents on this. When you update your phone or when you update your laptop, you do that frequently, right? Yeah. So that it can be functional. Yeah. However, and Jack Ma has said this, that our education system, it needs to be fast at addressing the fast-paced world. The world is changing very rapidly. However, on the ground, it takes time to implement, but not only to implement, but to monitor and evaluate, because you implement, we are going to implement pathways, and we are going to see what works and what doesn't work. And we are going to try and put it down to the primary level to see how we can adapt it. So indeed, it's a journey of 1,000 miles. Pathways at a primary level at the moment, I think we probably just need to focus on getting our foundation, our breakthrough for pre-primary and lower education, right, before we can even think of pathways. Yeah.
I want to ask a follow-up questions to you particularly, because you kept on mentioning the word investment. And what we were saying in the beginning is that Botswana has already spent so much money on education. Are we saying that it should increase the budget? Or are we saying we should restructure how we do things, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of what you just mentioned, like investing more in pre-primary school education, also taking into consideration what Kaene was saying earlier on, that the teachers need to be really upskilled. They need, teaching in Finland, it's an elitist career, and that's why they are able to produce those kind of students who are able to transform the economy and get that return on investment. So when you say investment, what are you really hitting on there?
Absolutely. When we talk about investment, we need to invest a lot in our resources. Funny enough, yesterday, because I live in a village, yesterday, Standard 5, a neighbor of mine, she came through and she's like, can I help her print out, make copies of the revision exam papers that they're using? And she said, Koskolong, they don't have a printer. They don't have this and that. And so the teachers, because obviously the teachers have to do the work, they said to the land, okay, take a paper, each take a paper, and everybody must come with 13 copies. And it's quite worrisome that, our schools, they don't have, such important equipment such as the computer, access to internet, the printer.
Yeah, it's a basic equipment.
These are very key. We talk about digitization, and like we do say that last week, for instance, there was an issue around the accreditation of some of our local institutions. We have accreditation. We have an accreditation institution, but how fast is it in addressing the issues of accreditation within our schooling system? Yeah. When you look at our education sector, I mean, I recently completed my master's in executive master's in entrepreneurship at the University of Botswana. And And, you know, as a learner, I get to question and ask myself, is this degree or qualification, if I want to go and study in Finland or wherever across the globe, will this qualification be recognized? So we know what needs to be done. I think it's also about having the right people for the right jobs in the right place, and not just to talk about it, but we should be having the right people who are willing to get the work done. And really, like, the culture in our institution, it needs to change for us to realize that investment. So we cannot talk about, you know, the impact of COVID, but we haven't invested a lot within our education system in terms of, you know, the computer, right, the internet, so the investment, we still need more. You know, the books in the schools, look at the books that we are having, you know, just the equipment or the material that the learners and also the teachers that they need. So yeah, a journey of 1,000 miles.
Thank you very much, Lillian. We're chasing time because this topic is very vast, and I'm going to now just call upon Tshimologo Matlhaga. You are a panelist here who holds very interesting experience, having worked in the highest institution of learning in the nation, and now actually doing grassroots work at an NGO level. And I think you are very well positioned to answer this next question, which is, you know, in our education system, should we not refocus on technical and vocational education? And I think you can go, should we focus more on our technical and vocational education? Also, with your grassroots experience, in that same vein, I want you to also address the issue of the mother tongue. If, you know, using mother tongue at primary levels or at elementary school level would help, you know, bring teaching and understanding students to a better level in this nation.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think the question around, you know, if we should now be focusing on your vocational education, vocational skills, is one that I almost think it's a given, it's a yes. And not necessarily focusing on it exclusively, but I think it's almost worrisome that it ever kind of left the conversation, so to speak, because I think it then even speaks into this thing of, I think as a society, us almost having a tunnel vision around how our economy is going to run and how it's going to be structured. And I think both Kaene and Lillian were mentioning this, you know, when they were, you know, addressing the questions that you asked them, in the sense that we have built a society that I think values certain, you know, degrees or certain skill sets or certain professions over others. And so there's been a lot of, you know, and that's even why, you know, your parents, when they ask where you're going to study and you suddenly say, I want to do performing arts, it's like, Or if you say, well, you know, I'm really interested in the mechanics of a car. I want to actually learn ABC so that I can actually open up my own shop and, you know, all of those kinds of things. It's like, you know, how about, you know, lawyer, you know, all those different things. And I think what that has done is almost to create a society and an economy that is very much leaning, I think, on one leg, if you want to say that, because I think we aren't actually taking the potential, one, of every kind of person in our society, and the recognition that not everybody is going to want to be in the finance industry. Not everybody wants to be an accountant, so to speak. But I think if we do have a society and if we have an economy that actually says, if you want to become a plumber, there's room for you. If you want to, you know, design and technology, if you're, you know, engineer, whatever it is that your passions or your interests lie in, there is space for that. And I think that helps to develop the person as a whole and also helps to develop our economy as a whole. And I think you then have situations where it's not like, we're suddenly now having this conversation that I don't think should have ever left. You know, when you go overseas, you know, people make decent livings as like plumbers, as electricians, you know, as carpenters, etc. And that's because they're skilled for those jobs. Their economies have room for them to actually to work in those jobs without them being looked at as a lower level kind of job, or, you know, it's for people who couldn't really go to school or any of those things. So I almost think even in us ever, you know, looking down on those kinds of professions, we've actually, in a sense, like crippled ourselves as a country, and we've actually constrained just the potential of our economy, because we need to be recognizing that every single person has something that they can contribute, and there needs to be the diversity. So we've obviously had this huge talk around diversifying the economy, and I don't think it should only be in the sense of moving away just from, you know, the resource of diamonds as the only, but I think even, you know, looking at how do we develop other industries? How do we develop other professions even within our economy? Because I think until that happens, you're gonna, and I think this is part and parcel of why we have a lot of graduates that actually are unemployed, because you say, okay, the professions or the careers that you have room for are, let's say, your IT, your sciences, your finance, your accounting. So everybody goes to school for that. So you're having thousands of accounting graduates, thousands of like IT graduates, thousands of finance graduates, but do we actually have enough, you know, within the industries to be able to absorb them? And the answer to that is no, you know, and so you're sitting at home without, you know, with your IT degree that you were told when you went into university at first year that there's room for this, it's in demand, etc. And so we end up really like operating in silos. And only at the end of the 5 years are you like, man, this thing actually isn't going to help me because there are thousands of us out there. And maybe even my degree is not recognized from my institution. And it just brings in all of those, I think, issues. So yeah, I think it's part and parcel actually of even diversifying our economy and even just creating a society that has room and I think really acknowledges that, yeah, that education and the value of it isn't just in, you know, being a lawyer or being an accountant or, you know, working in finance or whatever the case might be. But it's just as valuable if you want to go to school to learn a vocational skill, because there should be room for what that can allow you to do within our country. So yeah, that's just to answer the first question.
Yeah. Before you move on to the second question, let us just leverage on that a little bit. I really like how you unpack that, to think that, you know, something like farming has been looked down upon in our nation so much, but we still get food from our neighboring nations. You know, I really like this conversation that you and Kaene are bringing up, that, you know, there are things that we need, but we are looking down upon them. You know, farming is something that we really need in this nation to grow our economy and to prevent us from spending more money importing food, because even the transporting of that food into this nation, you know, the quality of it, if it's going to be being brought here all the time, you know, so it's things that are sustainable that we need to do with the mindset of, is this thing going to be sustainable in the long run? But also changing our, like I was talking about the culture, changing how we think about things. You also talked about something very, very, very important, that we are producing a skill set that we don't need. You know, do you think that if we are to get a return on investment, could we look at models like in Cuba, where obviously they're producing more doctors that they need, but they have identified markets where they can and could this also help diversify our economy?
Yeah.
So
just repeat the question for me, Juby.
It's not a question, just a conversation.
Oh, just a conversation. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I caught what you were saying at the end, but I think just maybe just to also chime in a little bit of what I think around just the design or how we went into thinking about what we needed as a country, even post-independence. So a lot of the talk, you know, post-independence in terms of building the country. And I think there was obviously value in it, but I think a lot of the focus was really on building a civil service. And so a lot of what your civil service will focus on is your white collar job. So, you know, obviously, you know, you're coming in, it's 1966, you've got 10 kilometers of tarred roads. There's, you know, very few graduates don't even have a university. There's a need, obviously, because And again, I think it is a thing of you're wanting to develop to look like what the model of development globally is said to be. And I think right there, that's part and parcel of as African countries, what we need to take a step back on, because we then adopting, let's say a British education system, we're adopting that kind of, how they govern their countries, we're adopting that model or that vision of development, etc. And are we saying, wait, we are Botswana, what are the needs that our country has? And so if, we realized, 50 plus years ago that we need to be developing, agriculture as a sector, etc., and not just the huge focus on the civil service, then I think that would have maybe even opened up the opportunities and the conversation from then, because the huge focus was on, let's have people who can work in the offices, who can develop our ministries, who can develop our, both finance ministry, both, all of those different, which were obviously needed. But the reality is that you then began to, sponsor students to go to school for those type of jobs. And I think that's what already set us up to then, to build the kind of country that we have now, where we're suddenly then saying, wait, why have we not focused on agriculture? Why have we not focused on your vocational skills and all of those things? Because in the very beginning, the model that we were focusing on, or the model that we were replicating of what development was that really looking at who we were as a country, as a people, and the kind of country that we wanted to build. And I think one of the huge things that we then need to even be looking at right now, even in the conversation of how do we restructure education and all those things, is really to say, what kind of country are we wanting to build? What is the purpose? I think Kaene was mentioning, what is the purpose of education? And I think until we begin to really hone down on what is the kind of society that we want to build as Botswana, what are the needs that we have as Botswana, and then to say, is our education system actually allowing us to then meet the needs of the country, allowing us then to meet the purpose or the design that we have as Botswana of where we want to go, who we want to be, what does that mean? And have we defined it for ourselves instead of it being defined continually by global organizations? And obviously they have we can't be in a silo, but at the end of the day, I think there needs to be a recognition that we can't be wanting to say, let's transform education and, let's rebuild. Of course, we need to do that. But I think if that conversation isn't partnered with what kind of society and what kind of country do we want to build and the vision around that, then it's almost like we're redesigning, but we don't have the end goal in mind. And that should inform how we then build.
I really like that, because most of the time we're just always benchmarking on who's doing great. But what you are talking about is we need to really, really consider, what do we want to build? Where do we see ourselves? I think this is a very important question, and I want to open it up to the other panelists. Kaene, are you ready to also just talk about, before we go into mother tongue issues, are you ready to just tell us, should we not refocus on technical and vocational education? I think this includes the creative and the innovative type of education, which you all have mentioned in your addresses. Kaene, you can take over.
Yeah, back in 2017, I was invited to Germany on a TEDx talk, and I was talking about the reimagining of education. Particularly, what I was talking about is the need to really look at and develop proactive individuals with talents that are quite diverse, and having an enabling environment for all these individual talents to thrive in different skill sets. And then particularly what I did is I juxtaposed, so I was comparing Botswana and Germany, particularly when it comes to vocational training institutions, where it's so easy to see Germany as kind of like this huge powerhouse of Europe, actually leading, with German cars in manufacturing, right, and innovation, and carpentry. So they're actually exporting so much of that, and and now in Botswana, what's quite ironic is that we're talking about technical expertise, but we have this tendency of then bringing in international experts. I think that's why we like the international consultants, international experts, right? To then do the technical, know-how of whatever project. Yet what's striking is that actually this is the same pool set of individuals that are there at vocational training institutions here. And the biggest oversight is that we don't value them. They're actually seen as some sort of a lower tier. So it's either, oh, fades. So unfortunately, since how can you go to, a technical college, right? And we're seen therefore as kind of like a last resort. And because now within our culture, we're seeing vocational training, oh, he's a carpenter. So now that on its own, it limits the individual in terms of fully expressing, fully realizing their potential. It also limits their market access because one, and we see a lot of them, quite creative, having beautiful designs, but and we would rather invest in the big corporations and spend more money in big corporations or things that are actually imported from China as opposed to really looking at the locally designed or locally manufactured ones, right? So the question is, should we, be really looking at retooling and re-embracing vocational training institutions? Absolutely, because that's what now the country is saying it needs. Right now, we're having affirmative action within the national agenda strategies. We're now talking about manufacturing. We're now talking about, exploiting leather and all of these things. We actually see them at vocational training institutions and vocational skills, which amazing young people have. So that's something, if we're not, if you're not careful to really seeing the damaging effect of how we look down upon vocational training institutions, we're actually going to continue to be left behind. And this is why countries like Germany, they're excelling so well. And they're also doing that not only as embracing vocational training as a culture, but even you can see that the investment in the vocational training institution itself. So what they would do is that they will actually parallel theory with practice. And it's really on practice. They are availing young people to apprenticeship, work experiences in leading institutions, worldwide, not just nationally, right? And they're prioritizing. So we're not only like looking at the fact that maybe if you want to be a carpenter, go and find, an SME that you can, attach yourself to, but it's really saying that as Botswana, to what extent do you value vocational training? Do you value locally groomed technical expertise? And if that's the case, explore existing bilateral, multilateral relations so that, individuals can get the best experiences, knowledge, and skill set so that they can be able to bring them here and incentivize on how they can really push the economy of our country. So, I mean, in a nutshell, absolutely, we really need to be investing more and really, reviewing the way we look at vocational training institutions. And we need to do better to capacitate and create incentives for those people who have acquired those skill sets to really thrive in this economy.
I like what you said, that we need to do better to capacitate those individuals, because you will see that even in Botswana right now, there are a lot of companies which are operating from a vocational point of view, like who are offering vocational services, but the ones that are really doing well are owned by expatriates. And I think it goes back into what you've been saying about how we classify careers, and this one is elitist, even how our government decided to do, like, these ones are rare skills and they'll be paid more within people who have attained degrees. But now let's go back to the vocational institutions, and you'll find that because this person, didn't do as well as others and they got a C, when you go to the vocational training institute, it is not as nice and welcoming. It doesn't have the right infrastructure. So the quality that is produced from our vocational experts, it doesn't match, that they're unable to compete with experts who have those companies. So I like what you're saying, that it also needs to be upskilled. We need to, dignify it, and we need to give them a fighting opportunity to be able to create the best services that they can be able to offer in the market.
And just to pick something that you just said, and I'm sure Tshimologo and Lillian here would have noticed this as well, is that, over time, because we continue to look down upon vocational training institutions, Some now of the big, institutions, the so-called big, local institutions, they've actually realized the value of that because they're able to keep up with the national strategies, national development planning, and also the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and so on. They're actually realizing the importance of those skill sets. So now, as opposed to really capacitating and empowering those vocational training institutions, the universities themselves, they're now coming up with those degrees, the degrees that have long been there. Now they're bringing them because it's an idea of Kaene would like to go to a well-renowned university where they can get the same skill sets, right? So it's not even about now course content. So it's not even about where, an institution was specialized, because vocational training institutions, they're supposed to be specialists, right? It's now about, no, I would rather have a certificate from the University of so-and-so, as opposed to, no, I would rather have, so that using that, the name, as opposed to their skill set, right? They're using the name, well, this is my gateway to success in life, as opposed to really the skills that I would have acquired. So it really is an unfortunate thing about Botswana, and particularly these times.
Thank you so much. I continue to welcome our audience to send through questions through the Zoom text box so that I can be able to ask the panelists more questions coming from you. And I would like to welcome Lillian into the same question. Should we focus more on the creative, the innovative, the vocational, and the technical training for our learners? And you are somebody who has really try to develop the education space. What has been your experience? What are your thoughts on this question?
Absolutely. I agree with what Tshimologo has just said and Kaene has just said. We need to do a lot in terms of promoting vocational education, as already been mentioned. I'm going to give you an example. I have a nephew of mine. My nephew, he wasn't necessarily the smartest child at school, right from primary, right? He really struggled, and he is not good with English, with maths, with any of these subjects. But what he was very good at is his ability to use his hands to do something. So he, from standard 7, then he went to junior secondary school, and from 3, unfortunately, he didn't do so well. But one thing that I know about my nephew is that you give him a cell phone, even now, you give him a cell phone, he can flash it for you. You give him a car, he can take out the engine. And mind you, this is somebody who hasn't necessarily been through to a TVET school before. And, I'm working with him to try and get him to that, to the school. So my point basically is, when I speak with him, he doesn't have the confidence. He thinks, what? No, I want to go and work for someone. I want to go and work in an office. But that's just not him. So we have a system where we talk about vocational education training, but are we doing enough on the ground to make young people understand the importance, to even give them the good career guidance, to help them to sharpen their knowledge around appreciating, vocational education, and the fact that, if I'm a young person, I'm very good with my hands. Like, I can literally create a car with my hands. I can make money. I can start my own business. So every day I get to work so hard just to make him realize that he is talented. He can use his skills to start up his own business, that we are actually in the process of registering. We've registered a business name for him, and slow we are buying him tools so that he can start, get calls from few people that he know around the village, so that they can engage him. He can help fix cars, and they can pay for him. But I still tell you, this is the challenge that we are facing within the education system. And maybe going back to that point of saying, do we need to introduce pathways from primary school. This could be one of those instances where we actually, appreciate the fact that we do have learners who are not academically strong, but they are very skill-based, very strong in that sense. And these are the learners that they should be channeled, particularly to vocational education training. Kaene mentioned Germany. I've worked with Germans through the GIZ project called UMatch, and basically it's about promoting or matching young people with work opportunities. Germany is very intentional about promoting vocational education training. We're talking about even now during the time of COVID, that career guidance services are on par. I mean, when it comes to virtual reality learning, these are the things that as Botswana also we should be aspiring to be doing to ensure that we sensitize young people of the opportunities, of the importance of them, appreciating vocational education, because it's not as if just because I'm a lawyer or I'm an accountant, I'm more better than you who actually are using your own hands, to create something or to build something. Actually, you might be even earning more than me. So I think a lot of resources and time and energy needs to be spent in promoting vocational training in a fun way, not in a way, but in a fun, creative way at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lillian. I'll just follow up with that question. And because we are about to run out of time, I would like us to now to just wrap it up very quickly in our answers. We are taking questions also from our live streaming on Facebook. So if you are watching us on Facebook and you want to ask the panelists the question, please can you write your question there, and then I'll be able to ask the panelists that question. Just to elaborate a little bit, Lillian, earlier on, you said, learners are also responsible for their education. I like that you're always very level-headed when you give out your wisdom about the education system in this country. You look at it from different angles, and you said learners are also responsible. And now you mentioned something particularly important, that your family members are supporting this young person who's not necessarily strong academically, but is strong vocationally. And I want to ask, do you think one of the gaps that we are having with not having a return on investment on education, could it be the lack of support also from our parents, from the parents, young people to school and say the teachers will take care of them, the education? Do you think the participation of parents and caregivers could help us get a return on investment on our education as well?
Absolutely. I mean, key stakeholders in education is not only the government, that we know for sure. It's the private sector. The private sector has to play a role. Yes. We talk about Bana going on attachments, on internship, so that they can get that sense of the practical side of their work activities. We talk about international institutions. Kaene and Tshimologo as well, running her own NGO. I'm sure they work with international institutions, doing programming for young people to help bring those opportunities to them. And this one, I cannot discount it. We do have instances where parents would say, but kana ngwana ka nna ga ke a rutega, ke tla go thusa yang. But tell her what I appreciated from my mother was the fact that, she was very supportive. She checked on me, I wanna go jele, o tlapile, I wanna go, o dirile homework. Ke ra gore le hana sa itse pi squared, what. But, she had this thing of looking within the village and seeing gore ke mang mo village ngwe leng gore o ka tswa rutegile botoka o ka nthusa. My mother used to work at an institute, at a certain institution, and they had a lot of international people coming from abroad to come and work at her workplace. And what I loved about my mom at that point, she would actually connect me to these guys. And that's how I actually learned English, how I improved on my English. I got to speak with them. They even taught me how to swim. So you see, the involvement of a parent is very, very key, no matter what, because this is really where also the foundation with the young person gaining that confidence, gaining that understanding of how important it is for them to take their education serious. So I can never discount the fact that we need batsadi to really stand up. And batsadi, we are not necessarily also looking at but and there are kids around in the village or in my community. What can I do to reach out to them to, help them to get access to opportunities? Because now I'm privileged, I have access to information. How do I make sure that that information, it trickles down? And this is why we always say, everybody here, even in this platform, even those that are listening on social media, we all have a role to play towards education, no matter how small or how big it is, no matter how it's you talking to one young person, in a year you have impacted just one life, but that is something. So really education is everyone's responsibility. Thanks, Juby.
Thank you so much, Lillian. I'm going to read some comments from Facebook, from our viewers before we continue with the last question that I think everybody's waiting for. There's a comment from Witepi Macheng, and she's saying, she's saying, this is an important conversation. There needs to be a focus on the foundations / at primary level. Teachers focus on finishing the curriculum instead of understanding the ability of students. If students have not grasped the basic concepts at primary level, they cannot progress. There's also a comment from Teboho Kamanyani, and it is the primary aim of education should be to enable the recipients to apply their faculties. It has nothing to do with marketability or employability. Those are secondary factors. And Morewang is saying, we are even taught how to think. Take me as an example. I am up all night trying to remember what Hitler did to start World War II, while I know nothing about the contributions of Botswana people to its history and how to apply this historical context to solving modern day problems. So those are not actually questions, that are comments, but I think when you are closing or in the next questions, you can reel them in, because we are left with a little under 10 minutes at this point. The question that we haven't answered is, and if you could just take 1 minute each, just talking about the introduction of the mother tongue into primary school curriculum or elementary school. Do you think learners can learn better if they were learning in their mother tongue, especially at those very, very primary and elementary school levels? Kaene?
Hold up, can you see me?
Yes.
So here I am thinking that I was gonna go loud.
1 minute.
I think there's, long story short, I think there's value in learning in our mother tongue, particularly with the transition of, because education, English, it's still a subject that one has to learn, similarly like social studies and so on. So I think there's a sense of familiarity and ease at which one is able to learn. I am a firm believer in understanding that it's not necessarily, it's not always about the language used in order to learn something, but it's particularly what you're learning, right? The content itself. So that is, to me, I think should be really the primary focus. Also, in as much as there's value in learning in your mother tongue, let's also not forget that we're working within a global village. And, to what extent actually, and this is maybe controversial, but to what extent is actually focusing a lot on Setswana going to have in the global impact, whereas in so many other countries we're learning French, Spanish, English, and different stuff, right? So I think there's that realization that we're not operating in silos, but there's a sense of familiarity that comes with learning in your mother tongue. But most importantly is what you use, the content of what you're learning, that's most important.
Okay, can we have Tshimologo, can you go ahead and just talk about the mother tongue? Do you think it will enhance our education system, especially at a primary school level and elementary school level?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. I've been thinking about it even just as we've been having this conversation. I think the priority at especially foundational levels should be just for, I think, for students to be able to engage with material. And if that means that, like, you know, including mother tongue instruction actually allows that, then I think we need to explore that. But I think even just as Kaene is saying, I don't know if it's unfortunate or if it's just part and parcel of what we have to navigate, is that we are essentially operating in a global village. And so, you know, you are gonna operate in a company, for example, that will require you to be able to speak English and to speak it fluently. You know, you see it so often, just even in a basic job application. Sometimes, you know, it will be very written explicitly that you must be able to communicate, whether it's Setswana and English, but that and English almost always comes in. But what I'll say about this is that I don't think that the mother tongue should be what's the word I'm looking for? That's what I'm trying to say. Because I remember being in school, and if you even were at break time speaking in Setswana, it would be like, you know, how we you know, we're speaking in English. So I think what the real thing, that the big thing that I would really advocate for is that if kids are able to express themselves better in Setswana and they're learning how to be confident in speaking, you know, if Setswana allows them to do that, then like there should be some space that allows them, because at the end of the day, what you're actually trying to instill in them is the confidence in speaking. And so as they go on and they learn the language of English, they'll begin to get more confident in English. But I think where you're telling kids don't speak Setswana if you can't, then you begin to make kids shy. They don't want to speak, they want to contribute because they've been told break timing, or those things. So I think it's a very nuanced kind of conversation, and what I wouldn't like to see is Setswana being kind of put down and English being elevated as the language that you should be learning. If there's a way for them to both be used, you know,
Right.
almost, then that's what we want to go for.
You know, I one of the primary themes that has come out of this these dialogues with the three of you wonderful panelists is, you know, is a sense of how our culture has hindered both our education and our development as a nation. Our culture and a sense of classism, like we were just saying that, you know, there are schools where you're not allowed to speak Setswana at primary school or at any level, anyhow. Unfortunately, us chasing time for our third panelist, I'm going to ask you a different question. The question is coming from Cindy Milemo, and because you had mentioned entrepreneurship earlier on, Lillian Moremi, do you think we should also introduce entrepreneurship and technology in vocational training institutions to empower Botswana to also start their own companies and not only be employees? Lillian, take it over. You can take over.
Please repeat the question.
Do you think entrepreneurship should be introduced in vocational training centers to allow Botswana to be able to have their own companies and not only be employees?
Absolutely. Entrepreneurship is very key for employment creation. And as has been said over the years that, you know, we want graduates to graduate and feeling like they are confident enough to, you know, turn their skills, their competencies, their talents into business. Even if you are employed, we must be thinking of 7 sources of income. Decide hustle. You do, even if somewhere, you know, you still need to enterprise your talents, your skills, and your competencies as well. But definitely, I mean, we've been talking about this for years. We need to, you know, make sure that entrepreneurship, financial literacy, these are very core subjects that we need to introduce within our education system. So can never emphasize this enough, and really to appreciate. I know everybody is really trying, even the private sector, to encourage young people to start up their own businesses. There's a lot of training in terms of entrepreneurship development trainings, but definitely from the vocational education, entrepreneurship needs to be one of the subjects.
Okay. I just checked my time. For some reason, I thought that we were ending at 12:30. I just realized that we're actually ending at 1 o'clock. We actually have more time. I almost wrapped us up, as it was so important that I looked at the advert again. We are still welcoming more questions from our online viewers. If you're on Facebook, please send us more questions to just thresh out this topic more. You can see what our panelists are very, very passionate about this subject. They're well versed. They have been in industry. They've been in the grassroots doing a lot of work, and they're basically saying, here we are, we have the knowledge we want to share with this nation, we want to develop this nation, please and include us. Yeah, I have a few follow-up questions if our viewers haven't come up with any questions yet.
Before you make follow-up questions,
yep, Emma.
I actually want to make comments towards
Yes.
what we and Vince were saying.
Yes.
And I think, as much as we are in this call as well as young people or just as a concerned Botswana, we need to continue to share information on opportunities. We need to collaborate in doing things.
Yes.
For those who might not know, Muitepi Matlhaga, she's actually the chairperson of Botswana National Youth Council. So,
yes.
Person of Botswana National Youth Council, that also Kaene here is a council member. So we have young people here that are well positioned. We are hoping we're not just talking. I'm honestly tired of talking. We need to do, and then we need to assess ourselves and do. We need to see results, right? We need to keep our accountable. That is very important. Tepi is also the co-founder of Young Love. So this is somebody that as young people, we are in this conversation. We should also reach out to each other to see how we can work together to make the change that we want to see. So that issue, teaching at the right level, they call it TARL. And I know that Young Love, they're really trying to inculcate also using technology, use of cell phones, and of course, schools accessing it via computers and whatnot. So they're working with different institutions, both government and private sector as well. So Muitepi is a very incredible leader in her own right, who is moving things within the education sector, she and her team, and we should commend such kind of young people. And then moving on to Vince, he's actually been part of Toastmasters, where we learn as young people how to improve our communication skills, how to speak proper, lifelong learning activities. I really admire, I really appreciate what Vince had just said, that, you know, our education system, and we need to change this. This could be one of why Kaene earlier on said, who be consultant, Lillian consultants. If we can work with international institutions or even in organizations, go with Germany, go America, why is it that the institutions in our country, they don't believe much in our talent? And here the issue is, I think we need to believe so much in our people. We need to give a lot of opportunities to our people before we can call people from outside, because this is how we are also going to ensure not only are we facilitating for employment creation, but we need to make sure that kids who are still in primary school, who are still in junior and senior secondary school, they see the possibility of a Botswana being successful.
Yes.
So we need to really appreciate a lot about the Botswana that are achieving, both young and old. We need to spotlight them. Our curriculum, why am I learning about things that don't really make sense for me now, or that are not going to really help me, whereas I would be appreciating a lot about the movers and shakers of this country, to see more. Around there, I should be seeing our streets being named by so and so, people who've really contributed to this country. So the point really is to say our education system and really our institutions, they need to highlight more on the achievements that Botswana on the ground has made. Thank you, Juby.
Yes. Thank you. Kaene, I just want you to really just elaborate, because we see year in and year out, probably not every year, but often we see the curriculum is being revised. We've also had a lot of, people, Botswana, studying overseas in these nations who have, innovative types of education. I want us to now start talking about what's the problem. We are saying that we want our education system to be better, and we keep on seeing curriculums being revised. What is missing in this revision that is not creating the right type of education that can give this nation return on investment on education? And what is happening? Why are our skilled people, our educated people who have experienced different types of education around the world, why are they not able to come and implement those systems more Botswana? Kaene?
Okay, I really love that question, because I think that's probably, when Lillian was saying a journey of 1,000 miles, that's essentially what we have been, battling with, the likes of Lillian, myself, all the way even to high policy impact. So what I will try to do is I'll try to answer it in kind of like a multi-layered, fashion. So the first one, I would look at it from ideation perspective, right? So I would say that potentially while we're trying to have those consultations, often at times to say there's a lack of inclusion in the ideation processes. So when we're ideating is, what kind of outcomes from this policy or from this revision would we like to achieve, right? And I think often at times is, most of what I think I have seen in the limited space or knowledge that I have is that there's a propensity to outsource, let's say, a consultant to work on the revision of national policies or even the education policies. And then by extension, this consultant would then have 1, 2, or 3 consultations with the various stakeholders. Often at times they're not really in depth. So the bulk of the work is actually more of more of the consultant actually doing, let's say, secondary, secondary research, which is really the books, existing literature, and so on, right? And I think that the problem, therefore, is when you are ideating that concept and you're actually mapping out of what you would like, let's say, a graduate profile to have, the anticipated outcomes, what kind of skill sets would you like for this learner to have? Why is it important for this learner to have this particular topic as opposed to that one? Why would we want to focus on teaching it like this as opposed to that? Whilst you're ideating that, I think there's a lack of inclusion of the actual people who will be teaching, the actual people who will be implementing that. So what you will see is a nationally designed policy, which is arbitrarily imposed to the teachers, right? And we don't actually have enough time to train and retool and capacitate the educators to fully understand what the revised policy is and its intention, right? So I think at ideation stage, that's what we're seeing greatly to be missing, that the consultant, there's a disconnect between the one who's actually, designing the policy, the ones who are actually, consulting with the policymaker or policy designer, and evidently the one that's going to be rolling out the implementation. And then second is the implementation process, right? So the implementation process, again, so from ideation, we have a beautiful, and often at times people don't realize this, that actually Botswana has some of the best incredible policies in the world. Actually other countries benchmark from us, right? Yeah. And the biggest issue, and well, I think value for your money, that's why you get the international consultant. So they're able to design the best policies. But the biggest issue then after the lack of inclusion and ideation processes is actually the implementation rollout strategy. That we don't actually have a firm understanding of how to execute an implementation process. What you often see is that there are missing links when it comes to monitoring and evaluation and accountability structures, right? So it's difficult to really come up with proper frameworks to ensure the monitoring of the training processes of teachers, the training processes of learners. It's difficult, therefore, to ensure the evaluation. You know, what metrics are we using? How often do we do that? There is a bill called Boteco, the Botswana Teachers Council, which was really advocating for the independence running of teaching profession so that they can become an independent governing body. And often at that, one of the arguments that were brought in was essentially to enhance the monitoring and evaluation measures, because teachers, there's so many, right? And it's really difficult as a government to have a centralized system where you can really ensure effective monitoring and evaluations of any training program. So it becomes more difficult to measure the key performance indicators, to measure the outcomes of any new policy, of any new system, because, well, we are understaffed, you know, and it's very difficult to ensure that. And most importantly about the lack of implementation processes is its accountability, right? How are you going to be holding people accountable if they're not, performing great at their jobs, or if they're not performing to the best of their abilities, or also if they're not actually performing to what's actually required, right? How are you going to be holding them accountable? And the lack of accountability structures, I often see it as twofold. One is that we don't have the necessary voice mechanism and exit mechanisms, right? So as students, because we don't know what the teachers are supposed to be doing, right? We don't know of what kind of skill sets they're supposed to be imparting on us. It's then very difficult to say, well, this teacher is not a great teacher. The only time I'm able to do that is when you're from, let's say, one teacher to the next, and you're comparing, well, like, I seem to be doing really well when this teacher is teaching me, but not so much there, right? So you can be able to voice out that, but who are you voicing it to? Who are you complaining it to? Do we have the necessary voice mechanisms to ensure that we hold people accountable, to ensure that we hold policymakers accountable, to ensure that we hold implementers accountable? And because that's not there, or that's not clearly defined, we continue with the lack of accountability. Most concerning as well is the lack of exit mechanisms, right? So you can complain, and I'm bruised, and you have batsadi bata, but the teacher will continue being there. You can complain that, you know, a headmaster is not actually, taking care of the school or its team or the well-being of its staff, but they are still continuing to do
even sexual abuse, and the teachers are still there.
Absolutely, right? So there's a lack of exit mechanisms in that. Therefore, how are you going to make sure that the accountability systems in the education, the accountability structures in the education system are really effective and they're reinforced? So there's that problem as well with the implementation of any policies that we're seeing because of a lack of disconnect in so many of these gaps. And I think lastly, it really revolves on civic active engagement, right? I think often at times is that education in itself in Botswana, the way it's been retooled, it's done as almost this exclusionary thing, that it's almost like, do you know what I mean? Yeah, that it's almost like, well, if you want to be a thought leader, right? You cannot do that within education. No, get the grades, get this, but if you want to do that, maybe leave school and do something else. That we're not actually able to see the coexistence of different aspects of life, that we're not actually able to cultivate skills development, life skills development within the education system. So that also becomes a problem because we are not actually developing a well-rounded individual. You are rather crafting, an outcome or a graduate profile that befits what you have written down on paper. And what you have written down on paper is barely based on education that's quite traditional, right? So I think, when you're looking at it, these are the three elements to me that seem to pose a great challenge and somewhat a danger to the economic welfare and the socio-political well-being of learners in itself.
Thank you so much. I know that you're about to leave for other commitments, and I'll wrap this topic up with the other panelists, but I just want you to just say, 1 minute, just what are your last words? Because this is a very important conversation, and we're so grateful to have had you on board. So just give us your last words.
Thank you so much. My last words, I'll do it as 2 bullet points. The first one is that in a growing country like Botswana, I cannot stress this enough. It's important for us to realize that we need to strengthen global synergies. We need to strengthen multi-sectoral linkages in order for us to really cultivate well-rounded, well-informed, valuable young leaders in the community. And if we're talking about, a return on investment on education, it therefore requires a collective effort. We cannot do things like in silos where we're having the Department of Tertiary Education really exclusively focusing on tertiary education financing without the inclusion of other institutions that are quite pivotal in ensuring what is it that you need to be investing in? What kind of skill sets are required right now? So for you to really make a well-rounded, well-informed, valuable young leader in the society, we need to strengthen global synergies. The last one is that we cannot do this if we're not including the necessary people that are going to be directly affected. So often in terms of policymaking, with all kinds of designs, is that they're arbitrarily imposed, right? And I say that sustainable development impact cannot be achieved without the intentional representation, active participation, and well-executed accountability structures. So if we're making any sort of revision in the investment for education policies, we need to make sure that we're including batsadi, kolapeng, we're including communities of which the learner itself is going to reintegrate the socialization of a learner. They're going to be there. We also need to include young people, the students themselves, understand what are their problems, what are their challenges, and not have somebody speak for them, but actually have them actively engaging in those policy processes. And we simply cannot look at education in a different format if we're not being intentional in promoting equality and a system where we're learning to relearn. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us and have a good day. Now we're going. Okay, Tshimologo Matlhaga, please let us follow up on this question. We are always seeing curriculum revisions in education, but nothing is changing. We also have a lot of Botswana who have studied up skills. With the conversations we've had with you in Davos Lab Dialogues on this particular topic of education, you have proven to be very ambitious and that you have a very big vision for the education system in Botswana. You have worked at the University of Botswana, and now you're also investing through working for an NGO at the grassroots. What is the problem? Why are we unable to implement the things we see in other countries that we have been educated in? Where is the gap?
Yeah. A lot of what Kaene was saying, I really agree with. And I think the two, big things that I just want to echo, even just from my experience in institutions of higher learning, is that one, there really isn't a huge, I think, involvement in multiple stakeholders, especially your educators and your students, around even curriculum development or even just their feedback. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, you are, I'm trying to not be too controversial.
Yeah.
But I'll give you an example. Say, for example, when I first started teaching, and obviously I think part and parcel of it is because they'll say, oh no, we trust you, we hired you because we think you can do the job. But when I first got there, it was essentially just like, all right, great, you're hired. Here's the course that you're going to be teaching. Somebody's saying, please be controversial. But it was like, here's your office, here's your laptop, here your courses go. And so often I kept saying, is nobody going to at least have some kind of conversation around what expectations are, around why we're teaching what we're teaching, around what the output is meant to be, what is the impact meant to be in terms of students. And for week after week and month in month, year in, year out, there was never any sense of, I never even felt accountable. It was like, nobody would ever ask you if you were at class on time, what you were teaching. It was literally just up to you. And so you ended up just you could decide what you wanted to do, when you wanted to do it, if you don't want to do it, And so for me, I just thought, how are we doing this when there's no sense of accountability, even from the people that are, you know, delivering and implementing. And there isn't a sense of synergy around, as a department, we are teaching these particular courses and we want the outcomes of our students or the impact that it's actually, you know, inputting in them to be A, B, C, D. And so even a sense of, as colleagues in a department, to say, are we actually just even being accountable? Is there a sense of giving feedback? What's happening in the classrooms? What is not happening? You know, when our students are leaving the institution, are they able to actually be, you know, members of society coming out of our department that are actually contributing? So I think those conversations actually aren't being had. It's just, you're hired, here's your class, go and teach, and then that's it. And I think even when students then give feedback, so we have this process at the end of the semester where students are giving feedback. I can tell you right now that that does not even, like, that doesn't factor into anything. Nobody reads that thing. That doesn't even impact on whether you're promoted, whether you are continuing to get a contract extension, any of those things. You know, so it's almost just like a process that happens, and then it kind of ends in the air. So it's like, well, there isn't any sense of taking the feedback that our very students that we are there for, because in a university or in a school, they're your clients, you know, in a sense, you know, they're the ones that you're there to actually work with. And so it's like, if there isn't any sense of feedback from them, and we aren't taking that, and that feedback isn't actually, it almost doesn't hold any weight, you know, because at the end of the day, we don't see them as key stakeholders in how we design this thing. So I think that's part and parcel of it. I think also, and I mentioned this a few days ago when we got on a call, that I think the interesting thing, I think, with universities, and I think it is true across the board, even just of, you know, education system as a whole, is that it really is, there are traditions and institutions and a system that holds this whole thing up. And interestingly, the other day I was listening to a podcast, and on the podcast was a guy called Fred Swanek. I don't know if you know him, but he's the co-founder of a school called African Leadership Academy. And, you know, they have a campus in Joburg, and he also has the African Leadership University, and they have 2 campuses, one in Mauritius, the other one in Rwanda. And he was talking about the model that ALU uses in terms of just educating their students at university level. And one of the things that I found so interesting was that their model doesn't actually focus on saying you're getting a Bachelor of Education, for example, or a Bachelor of Science. They essentially say to you, you are going to learn centered around your mission. So as a 21-year-old university student, we are presenting you with the challenges in Africa and the opportunities in Africa, say healthcare, governance, unemployment, etc. And there are a whole bunch of different projects you can work on, etc. But all of that is part and parcel of you on your journey defining, you know, what kind of opportunities you want to actually take advantage of on the continent, or what kind of challenges you want to solve. And so it is night and day different from kind of your traditional universities. And he was talking about, you know, getting funding, 1, for the university, but 2, even where they're able to operate. And he said, the interesting thing with universities is that they are really centered on tradition. And he was saying that it's really difficult for you to go against tradition, because essentially you're going against what we've all bought into. And he was saying the reason that they've actually gone to have university in Rwanda and in Mauritius is because they found that, like, those countries, they almost welcome innovation. And so the regulations are a little bit easier for them to establish something that goes against the grain, like ALU. And so I think even just thinking around that is like, how open are we to innovation? How open are we to, you know, a structure or a system that actually goes against even the global grain, you know? So he was saying they aren't focused on trying to be the next Harvard of Africa, for example, or they aren't trying to, you know, model ALU against, like, you know, your Oxfords or your Cambridge. 1, because they just don't have the time to do that. You know, your Cambridges, your Oxfords have been built on centuries of tradition, and he's like, things are moving in Africa. We don't have the time to do that, so we have to use what we have now, and essentially, you know, build our students. And the interesting thing is that their students can actually, they are able to compete with your Harvard graduates for jobs and work in the best, you know, organizations, etc. But they've come out of a system that teaches them very differently to how your Harvard or your Oxford and your Cambridge. And not to say that those things are bad, but I think just to say, how open are we actually to embracing maybe ways of thinking that aren't traditional or that push against the grain? Because I think unless that happens, then we're going to keep having this conversation over and over and over again. And then secondly, if there's no accountability measures, monitoring and evaluation, and actually recognizing that key stakeholders need to always be included in the conversation, then again, it's always being had at top policy level, and it doesn't always translate into the context it needs to be designed for. If we're designing a curriculum, who is it for? You know,
yes.
Why aren't those stakeholders actually having, you know, a say? If they aren't, then what are we doing? So yeah, I'm trying to kind of be quick because I know we're running against time, but yeah, in a nutshell, those are time is up.
4 minutes right now, and I'm going to ask Lillian Moremi, as somebody who has single-handedly tried to bridge the gap between academics and, you know, and careers. Have you ever been invited to the table to, you know, revise curriculums? And, you know, what is the problem that you see, you know, having been exposed to so many educational platforms? You're trying to implement some of those ideas and ideals into our own education systems. What are some of the barriers that you have come up across? Remember, we are running, we are under 4 minutes.
I haven't been invited to assess curriculum, and it's definitely something that I'd like to, and I hope I'll be given the opportunity to make a contribution towards. However, I've been involved in a lot of dialogue.
Yeah.
Within education reforms from government side, from the private sector and international institution side. I think when we talk about really investment, when I wrap up, we talk too much, eh?
Yes,
that's the problem.
Too much talk.
We talk a lot. So, you know, the reason why there's a problem, why we always identify problems, is because our expectations are so high compared to the on the ground. So the same thing with education. I mean, we know what needs to be done. However, it's not done fast enough. Yes. So what we need to make sure is our action is in alignment to what we are discussing.
Yeah.
Or our actions, we do more than we talk. That's what we need to do to make sure that we can stabilize. We can talk and talk and talk, but at the end of the day, it's really about getting the work done. I'm not a speaker myself. I get to but I like
you talk some wisdom.
That's what I thank you. I love doing.
Yes. I like what you just said, because, you know, we talk big, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, but you are saying that students don't have printers, they don't have printers. So, you know, basic things, but yet you are talking so high. Can you give us your closing remarks in 2 minutes, Lillian? Off this topic.
Yeah, closing remarks. Really, I just want to extend, I know we sit here and we talk, but and we're really grateful to the government, we're grateful to the private sector and all its key stakeholders, even our parents. We have to acknowledge the fact that parents do take part. Of course, there is still so much that needs to happen, and really to say, you know, the journey continues. We have started with an end in mind. We have set a vision. We've already talked what the kind of Botswana or the kind of education that we need. More than anything, everybody needs to make their contribution.
Yes, thank you.
And to Monana Kolapeng or the learner at home, you have a big role to play. Thank you, Juby.
Thank you so much, Lillian. I'll also invite our panelist, Tshimologo Matlhaga, to just also give us some closing remarks in 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, maybe even just 30 seconds to say, let's, as Lillian is saying, let's just stop talking, because I think we've had, you know, as Kaene was saying, the policy is there. We know what needs to happen. At the end of the day, you know, let's move it from just the talking into action, because otherwise we'll keep having the same conversation and we'll be 50 years later and we'll be in the same place still. So I think it just needs to move from talk into action, because the policy is there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, there was a delay. That's why I interrupted you. I apologize for that. Thank you so much, my panelists. Thank you, Tshimologo Matlhaga, Kaene Disepo, and Lillian Moremi. We've had an incredible conversation, and I thought this 2 hours was going to take a while, but it just flew. And I really hope that this recording will be shared with some very important key decision makers in this nation in terms of our education. I want to just thank Global Shapers for these Davos Lab Dialogues, especially on education. Are we getting a return on investment on our education? how is it affecting our learners and how is it giving back to our economy? Thank you. I've had the pleasure of hosting this conversation. My name is Juby Peacock. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you.